Welcome back, everyone, to Open Line. We are looking at Tennessee's critical role in giving women the right to vote. And we are talking with Miranda Fraley Rhodes. She is the curator of Ratified. That is a display at the Tennessee State Museum. Tennessee Women and the Right to Vote. And happy to have Miranda Fraley Rhodes with us. Let's go to some calls here. Let's go to Mike. Hello, Mike.
Hey, Ben, how you doing? And hello to your guests. I've got four topics I'm going to hit on quickly because I know you got other callers. One is I want to know the importance of the Rosie the Riveter era and how important it was for women to take over the positions that men had traditionally held. Also, I would like to know where the momentum and outrage is when we have a leader that's constantly calling women nasty. And also, when you say women got the right to vote for the first time, that includes women of color, specifically black women. And I listen and continue to do what you're doing, and congratulations on the 100th celebration of the suffrage. Y'all have a good night.
Well, Mike, thank you. Thanks for your questions there.
Thanks for your questions.
I'm interested in that last one especially. So he's asking the right to vote for women. Did this give black women the right to vote at the same time? What impact was it? You said race was kind of part of all of this, but was it white women and black women allowed to vote 100 years ago, or what about that?
That is a wonderful question, and thank you for asking that question because it's very important. This is one of the things that makes studying women's right to vote complicated. So technically, the 19th Amendment gave African American women the right to vote as well as white women. But that did not mean that African American women, especially in the South, that they did not face very significant barriers, including racial violence. One of the things that we did in researching for the Ratified exhibit, one of our team members actually went and studied the poll tax records in 3 different counties in Tennessee for 1922. And what we were doing, we were looking for African American women voters. Because in those poll tax records, it's like every African American woman's name that you find, that is a woman who really stood up to rules put in place to keep her from voting. So African American women wanted to vote. They were an important part of the suffrage movement, and they very much were ready to exercise their right. And the fact that you see African American women really overcoming a lot of challenges, including in some cases the threat of violence to vote, that really shows a great amount of courage. So the 19th Amendment, yes, it gave African American women the right to vote, but they often faced a lot of challenging in exercising that right.
That's fascinating. You went back and looked at who was voting. Were African American men voting? Were black men voting in large numbers back then? Not in as large a numbers as would have been possible due to those barriers and the threat of violence. We actually have some artifacts from the museum's collection on display that show African American men paying their poll tax receipts. And that really shows a lot of courage. Right. Mm-hmm. So African American men and women were voting in Tennessee, but they certainly faced a lot of barriers. And then, all right, he asked 3 questions, and now I'm sorry, Mike, I've lost your questions here. Take over. I wrote down take over positions. I don't know, Taylor. Maybe if you can remember that, let me know. As far as what we were talking about before, that women had been trying to get this done for a long time,
And there was kind of a shift in strategy to become more aggressive and more confrontational. We are not going to ask, we are going to demand, we are going to offend people, we don't care about being ladylike. Is that what kind of was decided? Is that what they felt like in this final push they needed to do there?
Well, it kind of depended on who you asked. Because the National Woman's Party with Alice Paul, that was very much their approach. But most Tennessee suffragists would not have agreed with that. And looking at World War I is a really great way to see the different perspectives on that issue. So Carrie Chapman Pat, who was the national president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and most Tennessee suffragists were involved with that group, she offered suffragists as workers for the war effort in World War I. And that was really courageous because she was a pacifist. That was going against her personal beliefs. But she thought that suffragists needed to show that they would support the nation in war. And many prominent Tennessee suffragists, like Kate Birch Warner and Catherine Kinney, they were very involved in World War I effort in Tennessee. And the opposite sort of perspective, Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party, they recognized that not all their members thought the same about the war. Some of them were pacifists, some of them were very pro-war. So they stayed focused on suffrage. They did not make a push for women in their group to serve the nation during the war. And they were embarrassing President Wilson every day outside the White House, and really pointing out the disconnect between his statements about a war to make the world safe for democracy and women not having the right to vote. So you get this interesting dynamic that you see develop in social movements. You certainly see this in other social movements where you have kind of a radical part of the movement that's pushing one sort of strategy, and then a more moderate part of the movement that's having a little bit different strategy. And sometimes that really works very well together, because you end up with a situation where the moderates start to look sort of their positions more appealing. So Woodrow Wilson actually justified him deciding to support a federal amendment for women's suffrage based on women's work for the war effort in World War I. He presented this as a war measure that the United States needed to give women the right to vote because of their service to the nation.
Fascinating. So World War I played a role. There's no doubt World War I played a role. And it's interesting when you look at these big moments in history to look at the other things that were going on during that time. World War I certainly was shaping much of everything at that point. And so since we are where we are today, I mean, I think about the pandemic of, well, the Spanish flu. And I wonder if in your research, I know that was going on in 1918, 1919. Did that play into any of the discussion back then? When you're researching this movement, what do you come across as far as that pandemic, the Spanish flu, and its impact in any way on what was being discussed? Again, because I think it's so interesting to look back and see what we can learn.
We actually have an artifact from the museum's collection on display related to the pandemic of the Spanish flu. So Maggie Sinclair Craig, who was from Nashville, she received a special recognition from the American Red Cross for her service during the pandemic. And that was really an extension of women's service in the war effort. That pandemic was so associated with World War I that a lot of women who were already engaged in war work, that they just carried on over into work regarding the pandemic. So visitors can actually see an artifact related to that very question in the ratified exhibit.
It is fascinating. And I know from interviews with other people that churches here actually became hospitals. And the Spanish flu was a major pandemic at that time, a major pandemic. And it's just interesting to go back into that time. And here we are 100 years later, divided, dealing with a pandemic, and we can I think we can learn things. All right, so we're going to take a break. If you want to call in, where's the number? It's there, right there. 615-737-PLUS. 615-737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.